Considered the leader in photographic education, Dean Colins has been teaching advanced lighting theories and techniques to photographers around the world for over a decade. This program is designed to provide some fundamental theories and techniques that can enhance your understanding of the science of photographic lighting.
As an advertising photographer, my work is very versatile, and because of that I need very versatile equipment. Broncolor is what I've chosen because it's probably the best and most versatile professional equipment I can find in the market. A lot of photographers have always said if I had that equipment I could take good pictures too, and we find that's not the case. It's not the equipment. And in the very beginning of your career you can utilize very simple equipment because many of your photographs you're going to take are not going to demand that type of versatility. So taking a small portable strobe and working with panels, which is an effective tool to maximize the strobe output, will give you the ability to create many different types of photographs, especially photographing people. Now when photographing people or in any situation to control light, you have to break it into basically 5 categories. The categories fall into keeping the diffuse value, which is the true tonality of the subject, consistent, controlling the brightness of the specular highlight, the shine of the object, to the diffuse value, controlling the brightness of the shadow to the diffuse value, and then the transfer, the edges of the shadow to the diffuse, and the edge of the specular highlight to the diffuse. So basically a light control situation is broken into 5 forms of control.
The bright, clean look of high-key portraiture is a popular style. In this segment, Colins reveals how to produce stunning high-key images with very little effort. To begin the first setup, assistant Tim Mantuani mounts a Metz portable strobe and a simple hot light to a specially designed strobe bracket. The hot light, which acts as a modeling light, allows Colins to see the direction and relative light qualities that the strobe will produce without affecting the exposure. After establishing a proper exposure for the subject value with an incident meter reading, Colins captures a few images of our model Karen. In the first image, the raw light from the strobe produces a very hard light quality, much like that of a sunny day. Only the side of the model's face is illuminated, and the contrast between the diffused value, or the true tone of the model's skin, and the shadow area is high. To increase the size of the light source, a Lightform P42 frame with a translucent fabric is introduced between the strobe and the subject. The strobe now illuminates the entire fabric, and diffused light passes through the fabric to illuminate the model. The panel is then positioned as close to the model as possible. Dean Colins talks about the use of light panels.
When working with panels, it's a little difficult because you don't see them, the effects, as readily as you do, let's say, with an umbrella or a light box, a contained box. It takes a little time to identify what's going on. So some good rule of thumb is that when you put the panel, you bring it in as close as you possibly can, and that's done by, you just keep bringing it in until you see it in the picture, and then you back it up. That's as close as you can bring a panel to somebody, which makes it as large as it can relative to the subject. And then making sure the panel is as far forward as possible to create the best wraparound effect as a main light. And that's again done by pushing the panel forward until raw light strikes the subject from the strobe, and then pushing it back until the subject is totally illuminated by just the panel.
With the panel in place, Colins asks for a new incident meter reading for the subject area. And to ensure an evenly illuminated bright white background, Colins asks for additional incident readings from several areas on the background wall. While the diffusion panel is now acting to illuminate the model, raw light from the strobe is still passing behind the panel and striking the background. Colins looks for meter readings that are 1/2 stop brighter than the incident reading in the subject area. To further ensure that the wall was evenly illuminated from side to side, the model and light source were positioned at an angle to the wall, so that the distance from each side of the wall to the strobe was nearly the same. Working with the new exposure readings, Colins then captures several shots of Karen in the diffused light. In the first image, raw light from the strobe produced a hard light quality and high contrast between the diffused value and shadow area of the subject. By introducing the translucent panel between the strobe and the subject, the quality of light was changed, and the intensity of light on the subject was reduced. By using a new incident meter reading for the subject area, A proper exposure for the subject was re-established by opening the aperture on the lens by approximately 1 1/2 stops. The soft wraparound quality of light produced by the large light source is now apparent, and contrast between the diffused value and shadow area is reduced. Also, because the amount of light striking the background was unchanged by the use of the panel, the background now appears brighter. Dean Colins explains.
Working with a panel in this case, not only did we produce a softer quality of light on the subject, lowered specularity and softened the shadow edge, but we also brought up the background. We actually lowered the subject's brightness because we placed a panel between the subject and the strobe, and we let the raw light hit the background. So in relationship, the subject got darker, but by exposing for the subject, and that's done by taking 1 incident meter reading of the subject with the dome aimed at the source of illumination, and that's what we're going to take our picture at, which sets the diffused value. Then by going back and taking an incident meter reading of the wall, and since it's a white wall, if the meter reading read the same on both, we would have a proper exposure of the subject, and the background would then be white. We really want the background white without detail, so we make sure that the background has 1/2 stop more brightness than the subject's reading, and when we take the picture, the background will be guaranteed to be white without detail.
After examining a Polaroid of the image, Colins decides to add a black light-form fabric to the bottom of the translucent panel. With the fabric in place, Colins captures a few more images of Karen.
One problem working with a self-standing panel is that even though the light's very, very soft in the subject, a big portion of the actual light area is below the nose to where it looks like the light is coming up and can cast kind of a ghoulish effect from a bottom light effect. The one way to get around it is to place a black cutter, a black material, at the bottom portion of the panel, which then essentially just makes it look like the light is coming from at a higher angle and creating a little bit more of a natural looking effect.
To reduce the effect of the ambient light bouncing off of the studio walls, Colins has a Lightform P22 panel with black fabric placed on the shadow side of the subject. The black panel actually increases the density of the shadow area on Karen, and in turn increases the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow. With the lighting complete, Colins works with Karen for the final images. Utilizing a diagram of the final setup allows us to see the ways that Colins has manipulated the light from a single strobe. The large translucent panel increased the size of the light source for the model, thereby producing a soft wraparound light quality on Karen. A second panel with black fabric allowed Colins to control the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow on the model, while raw light from the strobe spilled behind the main panel and exposed the background wall evenly.
When doing high-key photography this way, you have a lot of bounce ambience because you're really using the strobe to light the main light and the backlight, and that's being done by light spilling around. Because of the effectiveness of the entire room we were working with and bouncing light, the white walls, a black P22 light form panel was brought in very, very close as what we'll call a negative fill, to where instead of bouncing light into the shadow area, which is already being done by the walls, we actually wanted to create more contrast, which created the roundness and depth in this high-key photograph.
Lighting for glasses can be a difficult task, but there are some techniques that can make the job much easier.
When you work with glasses and photographing somebody with glasses, and you're going to diffuse the light, you either you don't diffuse it or you do diffuse it extreme. I often think about specular highlights, which is a reflection in the glass, the same as you might think of a bucket of water on the floor. If it's a very small area, the water is very deep, and that's what I consider the thick brightness of the specular highlight. But if you take the water and pour it over the floor, it becomes this very thin layer, and you can suddenly see the floor behind it. That's kind of what working with a panel is, and diffusing the light on glasses. If you do it to the extreme, you lower the specular highlight on the glasses down low enough to where you can now see the eye behind the glass, and you still identify that there's glass there because you have that very thin layer of specular highlight across it, which identifies the reflection, and it makes it to where it doesn't look like you have frames without glass in it, which can look very disturbing in its own.
To begin the shoot, our subject Dave Montezambert is illuminated by a single Metz strobe. The black panel near the camera is to protect the lens from lens flare. Colins records a few images of Dave. In our first image, the light from the strobe produces a very hard light quality on the subject. Only half of the subject's face is visible, and there is no separation from subject to background on the shadow side. To increase the size of the light source, Colins has a Lightform P22 frame with translucent fabric placed between the light source and the subject. Although the diffusion panel does act to soften the light quality, the size of the panel is not large enough to create a specular highlight that covers the entire surface of the glasses. Dean Colins explains.
One reason you want to work with an extremely large source of illumination when illuminating glasses is you have to realize the glasses are round and they almost have this wide angle feeling to where you see things through the entire room. And if you work with anything other than a huge panel, you're going to, let's say, if you just work with say a P22, which is 3.5 feet wide in this case, that's large in most cases, but with that wide angle feeling of the glasses, you're going to see the panel go, and it's going to suddenly have that break at the edge of the panel, which gives that bright highlight right down the middle, the break of the highlight right down the middle of the glasses.
To further increase the size of the diffusion panel, a translucent fabric is attached to a 6.5 foot by 6.5 foot P42 frame. The black panels on each side of the P42 control the spill light from the strobe and support the main diffusion panel. Because the specular highlight is a mirrored reflection of the light source, it's important to be aware of wrinkles in the diffusion fabric. Lightform double clips, which also serve to clip one frame to another, are used to stretch the fabric tightly across the frame to reduce the appearance of wrinkles in the glasses. After establishing a proper exposure with an incident meter reading, Colins captures a few more images of our subject.
One way you can get around the problem of this break in the middle of the highlight in the glasses is to work with a panel which is larger than you really need to work with. So what you can do is you place the strobe behind the panel to where it's fairly bright and the major source of illuminations in the front quadrant, and then the light slowly falls off across the panel. Thus, in the glasses, you can see that fall off and that soft edge transfer, and you never really have a hard edge.
In our first image, the raw light from the strobe produced a very hard light quality. By introducing the diffusion panel between the strobe and the subject, the light quality was softened, which is evident in the large transfer edge from the diffused value to the shadow. The spill light on the background from the large diffusion panel also provided some degree of separation between the shadow side of the subject and the background. Also, the large source made the glass in our subject's glasses visible. Because of the large size of the panel, the light energy from the strobe was spread across the diffusion fabric, which reduced the intensity of the specular highlight on the glasses to a point where the glass appears almost clear. Remember, when a specular highlight is spread over a larger area, it will diminish in brightness. To make further use of the single light source, a small plexiglass mirror is attached to a light stand and positioned behind the subject. Raw light is allowed to spill behind the main diffusion panel, and the light is then reflected onto the shadow side of our subject. The addition of this light provides shape and detail to the shadow side of the subject's face. In the second image, the addition of the diffusion panel created a soft light quality on our subject, but still only one side of the face was illuminated, and contrast remained high between the diffused value and the shadow area. By utilizing the mirror, shape and detail in the face are revealed in the shadow area, but contrast between the diffused value and shadow is unaffected. To reduce the density of the shadow area, a Lightform P22 frame with white reflective fabric is placed on the shadow side of the subject. Diffused light from the main light source spills past the subject and bounces back into the shadow area. By looking at the photographs, we can see that without the use of the white reflective panel, contrast was high between the diffused value and the shadow area. But with the addition of the fill light from the panel, the density of the shadow area is decreased, and detail in the subject's face is now visible. With the lighting of the subject complete, raw spill light from the strobe is now reflected off of a large plexiglass mirror to create a pattern on the background. The mirror can be flexed to change the pattern of light on the wall behind the subject. Colins asks for some color in the pattern, and with a single sheet of red gel in front of the mirror, a streak of red light is added to the pattern. Now, as Colins shoots the final images, Tim changes the shape and position of the light pattern by flexing and moving the plexiglass mirror. A look at the diagram of the final lighting setup reveals the many different ways that Colins has shaped the lighting of this photograph. To increase the size of the light source and to decrease the intensity of the specular highlight on the glasses, a P42 translucent panel was placed between the strobe and the subject. Raw light was then allowed to spill behind the main diffusion panel to strike a small mirror, which returned light back onto the subject to provide shape and detail to the shadow side of his face. To reduce the contrast between the diffused value, the true tone of the skin, and the shadow, light from the main diffusion panel was bounced back into the shadow area with a white reflective panel. And finally, raw light from the strobe was reflected off of a plexiglass mirror to create the patterns of light on the background wall. We can see in the final photographs that the use of a plexiglass mirror can create a variety of interesting light patterns, and that the addition of a colored gel to the mirror can make the light patterns creative and fun. Dean Colins has some final comments on backgrounds.
Dave is a photographer himself, kind of a visionary, very, you might say futuristic type person. So when I thought about the background, I wanted to come up with something, kind of a cosmos feeling, and letting a raw strobe strike a mirror that I could flex. And as you flex that mirror, it created different shapes and patterns across the background. I had any selection I wanted of shapes and configurations on the background. One thing important, though, is to make sure that even though it's a white wall, that not much of your main light ever contaminates that wall and keeps it very, very dark to where when you finally project that highlight from the mirror on it, it does show its pattern. Anytime you drop a gel on a mirror to change the color of it, you have to realize that the color of the gel will actually double when it comes back, because it's got to go through the gel, strike the mirror, and then bounce back through the gel again. So you double any effect. 20 cc's of amber becomes 40 cc's, and so on. One thing we're trying to point out with this shoot is that you can be very effective in lighting with just one source of illumination. This picture was taken with one strobe. And one reason we use light-form panels is that it doesn't contain the light. It lets light go past it, so where you can get an effect in a certain area, such as the light going through the panel and then having a soft effect on the subject. But then the raw light going behind the panel and in front of the panel can work as very effective sources on the background, as edge lights and as fill lights. So working with a non-contained light control device, such as a panel, is an effective way of maximizing the power out of a small portable strobe.
The soft feel of window light provides a cozy feeling to these portraits on muslin. Before the shoot begins, assistant Tim Mantuani attaches a Bogan magic arm to one of the legs on the tripod. In this case, the sturdy adjustable arm is used to hold a black flag in place, which guards the camera lens from lens flare. At this point, our model is illuminated by a single strobe, and an incident meter reading is used to establish a proper exposure for the diffused value or true tone of the subject. With the model in position against the drape of muslin, Colins captures a few images to establish the effects of the raw strobe light. Our first image reveals the hard light quality that is produced by a small light source. An obvious shadow of the subject is thrown onto the muslin, and dense, well-defined facial shadows are prominent.
Controlling light is controlling the brightness of the specular to the diffuse and the shadow to the diffuse in contrast. But a proper exposure of that control is to place the diffuse value on the appropriate part of the film. That's done by taking an incident meter reading and aiming the dome at the source of illumination, not at the camera. A lot of people mistake it that you aim it at the camera, but that averages in the contrast on the face. What I want is a concise diffuse value exposure. Again, aim the dome at the source of illumination, and that will give you an f-stop, which thus you put into the camera and then properly exposes the subject.
To increase the size of the light source and soften the light quality, Colins has a Lightform P22 frame with translucent fabric positioned between the strobe and the subject. Dean Collins talks about the use of panels for the photograph.
There's a lot of people that always talk about window light. They love the quality of window light. And when you look at this photograph, you think it was done by a window. But if you really think about what a window is, it's nothing more than a large diffuse source of illumination. And that's no different than a panel, a translucent P22 panel, placed between the strobe and the subject. So you still have a source of illumination, which is a strobe, very similar to the sun. But by introducing that panel, it creates the effect as if the sun is on the other side of the building coming through a very soft bank of illumination. So do yourself a favor and make your life a little easier, because this type of window light can be done any time of day, whether it be raining or dark outside.
With the panel in place, a new incident meter reading is taken, and then Collins places a black net filter in front of the camera lens. The cotton net filter is used to add just a touch of diffusion to the images. With the simple lighting setup complete, Collins captures some final images of our model. The diagram of our setup shows that Collins set the strobe back away from the subject so that the entire translucent panel would be illuminated. It is the large size of the panel that produces a soft wraparound light quality. A look again at our first image shows the hard light quality produced by the raw light from the strobe. By introducing the diffusion panel, the light quality is softened, and the long shadows on the model and the background disappear. The contrast, though, remains relatively high between the diffused value and the shadow on our model, a look that Collins preferred for this sitting. If you or your client wanted to reduce the contrast, a simple white reflective panel set on the shadow side of the subject would allow you to bounce diffused light back into the shadow area. The effect of a reflector fill panel can be seen in these images. The bounced light raises the level of illumination on the entire left side of the image and reduces the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow. Dean Collins comments on controlling light qualities.
A lot of people will ask me when I photograph white people or black people, do I manipulate my exposure? Do I adjust my exposure for the skin? And the answer is absolutely not. You expose for black skin the same as you do for white skin, but really that's what light control is all about, the control of the specularity and the shadow to the diffuse. When you photograph black people, you work more with the shine, the specularity, the oils in the skin, and that is the range you create depth with. On white people, you work with the shadow to the diffuse range, the shadow to the true tonality. That's one reason the panels are very nice, is because when you work with a panel, you have the control of a very large source of illumination, but if you wish, let's say, more specular range in black skin, you can bring the strobe closer to the panel, illuminate a little bit smaller of an area, which then builds more specularity. So a panel really gives you specular control and shadow edge control because of that distance of the strobe to the panel. One thing about this photograph that I want you to point out is the area that it took to take the photograph. It's very, very minor. The subject's sitting on the floor, and to get a full length of the subject since it's sitting on the floor, a 150 millimeter lens 8 feet away will do the job. So it's not like you need a huge studio to do a photograph like this.
Rembrandt lighting and a simple black paper vignette make these images a stunning example of classic portraiture. To begin, an incident meter reading is taken in the subject area to establish a proper exposure for our model. Illuminated by only a single Metz strobe, Karen strikes a pose for Collins as he records a few images under the raw light. In the first image, our subject and the background receive the same level of illumination. The small light source produces a hard light quality on Karen, and contrast is high between the diffused value and the shadow. To alter the quality of light on the subject, Collins places a P22 translucent panel between the strobe and the subject. The panel is adjusted by Collins to create a soft wraparound light quality on Karen. A new incident meter reading is taken to re-establish a proper exposure for the subject area, and Collins then works with Karen to capture some new images. A look at our first image reveals the high contrast and hard light quality produced by a small light source. By introducing the translucent panel, the size of the light source is increased, and the resulting quality of light is much softer. Also, contrast between the diffused value and the shadow on our subject is slightly reduced.
This quality of light, Rembrandt lighting, has been done very successfully for years, and most photographers have used umbrellas or contained sources of illumination. This was done with a panel simply because you can get the exact same effect as a box or an umbrella, but now you have the ability to use all the excess light going past, illuminating the background, picking up the mirror, hair light, and the fill light. So you get the exact same effect, but you maximize the power out of a small portable strobe.
To reduce the amount of light striking the background, a second P22 translucent panel is placed between the strobe and the background. The two panels are clipped together with light-form double clips. Also, Colins adds a black fabric to the lower half of the main light panel to reduce the amount of light coming from below the model's waist. With the lighting adjustments complete, Colins records several new images of Karen. In the second image, the large diffusion panel softened the light quality on Karen, but the background still received raw light from the strobe. The addition of the second translucent panel reduced the amount of light striking the background to a level equal with the subject area. The subject now appears brighter relative to the intensity of the background.
Since I'm working with a panel in this situation to control light quality, it also affects the background brightness relative to the subject. If I wanted to make the background even brighter in this case, I could have put a second layer of translucent material between the strobe and the subject, which would have lowered the subject's brightness, but when I readjusted the exposure for the subject, the background would have even got brighter. I didn't want the background any brighter in this case, so what I choose to do is not place it between the strobe and the subject, but actually place it between the strobe and the background, which lowered the background brightness relative to the subject, and this is how I got my background control. If I wanted the background even darker, I could have put another layer or maybe two layers to lower the background even more. So the control in this case is the strobe, the light between the strobe and the background is being manipulated by one layer of translucent panel.
To provide fill light for the subject area, raw light spilling in front of the main diffusion panel is bounced back toward Karen with a P22 white reflective panel. The soft fill light reduces the density of the shadow area on our model, which in turn reduces the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow. In the third image, although the main light quality was soft, the shadow side of the subject was unaffected and contrast was relatively high. By introducing the white reflective panel, the bounced fill light reduced the contrast between the diffused and shadow. Dean Colins talks about the use of the reflector panel.
An efficient use of your strobe when working with a fill is to back your strobe as much as you can from the main panel to where it evenly illuminates the panel, but yet raw light now can go past the front of the panel, strike your fill reflector, and bounce back in. And that gives you the most effective fill that you can get in the situation.
To create separation between the model's hair and the background, a small plexiglass mirror from Bogan is attached to a stand and raised up to reflect raw spill light from the strobe. As a final touch, Colins tapes a simple black paper vignette to the front of the lens shade. With the lighting complete, Colins works with Karen to capture the final images. A look at a diagram of the lighting setup reveals the methods of light control that Colins used for the photograph. To control the main light striking the subject and the background, two translucent panels were placed between the strobe and the subject and background. To reduce the contrast between the diffused value and shadow area on the subject, raw light from the strobe was bounced off of a white reflective panel into the shadow area on the subject. And finally, to provide separation for the hair from the background area, raw light was reflected off of a small plexiglass mirror onto Karen's hair. The effect of the small mirror reflecting raw strobe light onto Karen's hair is evident in our fourth image, and the use of the black vignette in front of the lens can be seen in our final image. The modeled background slowly fades to black toward the edge of the photograph, which focuses our attention on our model Karen. Colins discusses the use of a vignette on the lens.
When working with a vignette on the front of your camera, this is done to create kind of almost the effect of burning down the side of the print to force more attention to the center of the photograph, or in this case the subject. The controls of a vignette are essentially four. How close is the vignette to the front of your lens? What is the millimeters of your lens? Is it a wide angle or extreme telephoto? What is the f-stop of your camera, to where you have a large depth of field or a minor depth of field? And then finally, how close is the camera to the subject? How much are you focused out? Because the closer you get to the subject, the shallower the depth of field, the more out of focus and the less effective the vignette's going to be.
Considered the leader in photographic education, Dean Colins has been teaching advanced lighting theories and techniques to photographers around the world for over a decade. This program is designed to provide some fundamental theories and techniques that can enhance your understanding of the science of photographic lighting.
I find that when photographing outdoors, a photographer will either be proactive or reactive. A reactive photographer is one that just deals with what's there, reacts to the situation, is really more controlled by the elements than controlling the elements themselves. A proactive photographer is one that studied light control and understands their situation to wherever they go, whatever the elements are, they can make it look whatever effect they want. To understand light control, you have to understand basically 3 components within 5 forms of control. The components are the diffuse value, which is the consistency of the true flesh of the skin, or the true tonality of the skin. The specular highlight, which is really the mirrored image of the source, which creates the diffuse value, the mirrored image of the sun on the face, which identifies moisture or the shine in the skin. And then the shadow, which is the area underexposed relative to the diffused value. The 5 forms of control are the control of the contrast between the diffused and the shadow, the control of the contrast between the diffused and the specular, and the edge transfer, the hard edge or soft edge transfer between the diffused and the shadow, and the diffused and the specular.
In this segment, Colins uses light control methods to manipulate the sunlight and create a bright, sunny feeling while working in the open shade. To begin the setup, Colins has a Lightform P15 frame with translucent fabric placed next to the model. The panel is positioned as close as possible to the left edge of the photograph. With the panel in place, raw sunlight is then reflected off of a large plexiglass mirror onto the panel. With the entire fabric illuminated, the panel turns into a large, diffused source of light. The soft wraparound light quality from the large light source raises the subject's level of illumination, and an incident meter reading is taken with a Gaussian Lunistar F meter to establish a proper exposure for the model. Working in a shaded area, Colins begins to capture a variety of different poses on film. The large mirror can be flexed to increase or decrease the size of the area illuminated on the diffusion fabric, which directly affects the quality of light produced with the panel. A look at a diagram of the setup reveals that although Colins selected a shaded area to place his subject, by simply redirecting the raw sunlight off of a mirror to a diffusion panel, light control is now possible in the subject area. A photograph taken prior to the use of the mirror and panel shows the flat ambient light that existed in the shaded area. By bouncing sunlight through the diffusion fabric, the light quality becomes directional, and the illuminated model becomes the focus of attention in the photograph. Dean Colins comments on the control of light outdoors.
One of the problems with working outside is you can't move your light source. It's the sun, and you may come up with a beautiful background you find, and it looks wonderful through the lens, but you realize that with the subject being there, you'll absolutely have no illumination on them. So by taking a mirror and then pumping it through the panel, this gives you the intensity of the light, but by pumping it through the panel, it has a very soft wraparound quality like the late afternoon light you might want in that area. And with those combinations, you essentially can pick up any background, any direction you want, and make it work for you.
A grassy park can be a perfect location for a portrait. In this segment, Colins reveals how to control the light of the midday sun. At midday in a local park, Colins positions our model Shirley in a sunny, open area. An incident meter reading is taken to establish a proper exposure for the subject area, and Colins then captures a few images of Shirley in the raw sunlight. In our first image, the raw sunlight produces dense, hard-edged shadows on our model's face and body. Contrast is high between the diffused value or true tone of the subject and the shadow area. Dean Colins talks about shooting outdoors.
One of the nicer types of light to work with is the late afternoon sky. The sun is set, the sky is very evenly illuminated, the light's beautiful, it wraps around, it's that very soft quality we look for. But we don't always have the opportunity to shoot at that time of day. We got to shoot at any time of day when the sun's still straight up or at an angle. So working with a panel, especially a large one like a P42, which is 6.5 feet by 6.5 feet, and putting it right next to the subject, it creates a very soft wraparound quality as you would with the late afternoon sky. But one thing you have to deal with is that when you do put the panel in there, the subject is sitting in the shadow of the panel, and you expose for that subject, so it makes the background brighter and the foreground brighter. Those are the things you have to deal with, which is different. Late afternoon sky, you don't have that problem because the subject and the background are lit by that both at the same intensity. So there is a contrast control you're going to have to work with and deal with in a challenge.
To increase the size of the light source, a Lightform P42 frame with translucent fabric is attached to a stand and positioned between the sun and the model. Colins has the panel positioned as much in front of the model as possible. A second meter reading is taken to re-establish a proper exposure for the subject area, and Colins then works with Shirley to record several new images of our model in the diffused light. A look at our first photograph reveals the hard light quality produced by the raw sunlight. At this point, the subject and background received the same intensity of light. By introducing the P42 diffusion panel, the size of the light source was greatly increased, which produced a soft, natural light quality on Shirley. Because the large panel was extended in front of the model, light wrapped around and illuminated her entire face, which reduced the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow area. Also, because the subject area is now receiving less light than the background, and our camera is set to properly expose for the subject area, the background now appears brighter.
When working outside with a panel and the subject sitting on the ground, if you work at a high camera angle, you see a burned out foreground and burned out background in front of the panel and behind the panel. So by working with a camera at a lower angle, firing across the ground at that angle, you're going to actually eliminate that foreground and background problem. But in order to do that, you have to switch to a little bit longer lens, because even using a 150 millimeter lens on your Hasselblad, which is considered a telephoto, would create a very tall looking subject because you're in so close. So by working with a longer lens like a 350 or a 500 and backing up, you change and compress that perspective, and it looks very natural to the eye and the way you're viewing the subject. Another thing it gives you is opportunities to choose many different angles, because it's viewing a very narrow portion of the background. And probably the biggest advantage, though, is it creates a view, a compression that it's very unusual to the human eye. So when they look at it, it has a very interesting quality to it, and it's very enjoyable to look at.
To add the feeling of direct sunlight and to provide separation for the subject's hair from the background, a large plexiglass mirror is used to bounce raw sunlight back onto our model's hair. The mirror can be flexed to adjust the pattern and intensity of the redirected sunlight. To increase contrast between the diffused value and the shadow area on the subject, a Lightform P22 frame with black fabric is positioned on the opposite side of the main diffusion panel. The black panel serves to provide negative fill on the model, which increases the density of the shadow area. As Colins begins to shoot new images, Assistant Ray Storms flexes the mirror to provide Colins with a variety of different images. By looking at the diagram, we can see that the P42 translucent panel increased the size of the light source, which softened the light quality and decreased the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow area on our subject. The black panel placed opposite the main diffusion panel provides a sort of negative fill, which helps to regain contrast between the diffused and shadow. And finally, the flexible plexiglass mirror is used to redirect the raw sunlight for separation and texture in the model's hair. Our second image showed the effects of the large diffusion panel placed between the sun and the subject. Contrast was reduced between the diffused value and the shadow, and the subject value was decreased relative to the background value. By introducing the negative fill panel, contrast between the diffused and the shadow was slightly increased, and through the use of the mirror, separation was increased between our model's hair and the background. Colins talks about using mirrors outdoors.
When you work with a panel outside, one thing you do is you lower specularity. Specularity is the atom in contrast, which creates we'll call it the luster in the hair. So we really lose a lot of the shine somebody has in their hair. This girl has beautiful hair, and this specularity is an important part. So we pick that back up by utilizing a mirror from the backside kicking in just as it would be the sun. This particular mirror it's a fairly thin mirror, and we have a capability of flexing to control the brightness on the subject, to where if we flex it out, it diminishes the brightness. If we flex it in, it actually increases the brightness. It's like focusing a highlight from a magnifying glass.
An understanding of light control can turn the harsh light of late afternoon sun into a soft, natural light for beautiful outdoor portraits. To begin the shoot, Colins places the model in the raw light of the late afternoon sun and records a few images to establish the effects of the raw sunlight. Our first image reveals the effects of our model illuminated by the raw sunlight. Because the model is side-lit, much of her face is in the shadow of her hair, and contrast is high between the diffused value and the shadow areas. Colins talks about the problems of working in raw sunlight.
When you start controlling your light outdoors, you have a whole different way of viewing the situation. You have to look at a background and not take it literal. If you're just dealing with the light that's there, a reactive photographer, he's going to see things as they are, and that's how they're going to record. But when I'm out there looking around, I have to think that it's probably going to be out of focus. I have control of my f-stop. I can change it to any depth of field I want, so I can create any focus I want. And I'm going to be able to control the background brightness by dropping the subject brightness. So I may look at a background and say, yeah, it looks cluttered right now, but at f4, which is going to be very out of focus with that depth of field, 2.5 stops over, it may pick up just the pastel or just the feeling that I want for this particular portrait.
To alter the quality of the raw sunlight, a Lightform P22 frame with a translucent wind fabric is placed horizontally between the sun and the subject. The wind pockets in the fabric allow air to flow through the fabric without allowing raw light to spill through. To take advantage of the large size of the diffusion source, the panel is positioned as far in front of the model as possible. With the panel in place, Colins captures a few more images of our model. In the first image, the raw light from the sun produced harsh shadows on the model's face. With the introduction of the diffusion panel, the large light source evenly illuminates the model with soft, natural-looking light. And because the intensity of light was reduced by the diffusion panel in the subject area, the contrast between the diffused value, or true tone of the subject, and the shadow area was also reduced.
Normally in this situation, this light would be useless. Without the panel, you have this hard light. It's actually a little bit behind her. Most of her face is in total shadow, which is being cast by her hair across her face. But by dropping a panel in there, between the translucent panel, a P22 on each side, which means that it's 3.5 feet high by 6.5 feet wide, you can actually make the light wrap around to the face by taking the long side of the panel, extending it out in front of the face to where the sun illuminates the panel, which illuminates that of her face. But since it illuminates the entire length of the panel, that light now is out in front of her by about 5.5 feet, which wraps around into the face and creates that very natural wraparound quality.
To increase the contrast between the diffused and the shadow, a Lightform P22 with black fabric is placed on the shadow side of the model. The negative fill panel slightly increases the density of the shadow area, which in turn regains the contrast lost with the use of the diffusion panel. Colins then records the effects of the negative fill panel.
Negative fill is, in this case, fairly important because the subject is blonde, very light-skinned, and the only thing that's going to create three-dimensional form is going to be shadow form. We didn't have quite the problem in this case because there wasn't that much ambient, but if you get into a situation where there's a lot of white foliage, light foliage, white walls, when you drop that translucent panel in there and there may be some sun going along hitting a wall bouncing back in, that's when negative fill is going to be the most important time.
To reintroduce sunlight into the portrait, a large plexiglass mirror is used to bounce raw sunlight onto the hair of our model. The mirror can be flexed to control the intensity and spread of the beam. Separation between the model's hair and the background is increased. With the setup complete, Colins works with the model to capture the final image. The diagram of the setup shows that Colins controlled the late afternoon sun by introducing a large diffusion panel between the sun and the subject. A black panel was placed on the shadow side of the model to control the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow. and with the use of a plexiglass mirror, the raw sunlight was bounced back onto the model to provide separation between the model and the background. A review of the final images reveals the effects of the raw sunlight, the use of the diffusion panel to increase the size of the main light source, and finally, the effects of the negative fill panel and the mirror. Raw sunlight can make a beautiful backlight for a portrait. In this segment, Colins explains how to turn high contrast into simple light control.
Okay. Most people use in-camera metering when photographing outdoors, and this is fine, but if you start dealing with light control, a proactive method, for instance, dropping a panel between the sun and the subject, it's going to be fooled. If you drop a panel between the sun and the subject's going to drop a stop, maybe two stops. An in-camera meter will not detect that much change because it's also metering the background, which is not changing at all. If you're dealing with an ectochrome film and you have to be within a third of a stop accurate, this won't work at all. So we find that the best way of metering outdoors is using an incident meter. Now, an incident meter is basically a meter which, when read in the subject's illuminated area, it's going to place on the film a proper exposed diffuse value. This is done by it exposes for a hypothetical 18% gray card in the scene and properly places that on the film. If the subject is twice the reflectivity of 18%, it'll appear twice as reflective, and if the subject's half the reflectivity, it'll appear half. So what the meter is really doing is, by a standardized method, properly exposing the true tonalities, the diffuse value, on the film in this form of metering.
To begin, Colins positions his camera on the tripod and then adjusts the height of the tripod. A single release button on the Bogen tripod allows Colins to quickly and easily adjust the height of the camera. After locking down the tripod, Colins then levels the camera on the ball head to frame up our model Shirley. After an incident meter reading was taken to establish a proper exposure for the subject's diffused value, Colins records a few images of Shirley. With the late afternoon sun behind the model, a black flag was set above the camera lens to avoid lens flare. Our first image shows that by exposing for a proper diffused value on our subject, the contrast between the light level on the model's face and the hair light and background is beyond the latitude of the film. Detail in the hair and background is lost due to the overexposure of those areas.
With working with backlight situation, what can appear beautiful when you first see it can sometimes be pretty disastrous finally on film, because the latitudes and contrast of what the eye sees and the film sees are quite a bit different. So by properly exposing for the subject with his backlight situation without any type of light control, you have a decent exposure of the face, even though there is no definition around us, and the background is completely blown out, and the hair light is extremely strong on the subject, losing all detail in the hair.
To increase the level of illumination on our model, a Lightform P15 with white reflective fabric is set just out of the image frame to bounce soft, diffused light back onto the model's face. A new incident meter reading is taken to re-establish a proper exposure for the subject area, and Colins then adds a Softar No. 1 diffusion filter to provide a different mood for several of the exposures. With the setup complete, Colins works with Shirley to create a variety of different poses and moods. A look at a diagram of the setup shows the simple use of a large white reflector panel to bounce diffused light back into the subject area. By raising the level of illumination on the subject, the difference in intensity between the light on Shirley's hair and the light on her face was reduced. Dean Colins explains.
When working with a panel outside in a reflector capacity, it can either be considered reflector fill or reflector main. Reflector fill is when you fill in the shadow with a panel. Reflector main, in this case, is what we're doing, is one that creates the quality of the main light, or produces the illumination for the diffused value. When I work with a panel, I choose a white one over a silver. A silver panel is very specular, returns a lot of bright light, a lot of specularity, moisture shining the skin shows up, plus it's very difficult in the model's eyes. So we choose a white one, in this case a P15, which is 3.5 feet by 3.5 feet, and we bring it in as close as we possibly can. Now, a lot of people want to take them down low and bounce them up, but that creates a shadow from the nose to go up and looks very unnatural. So we take them up about even to the face, a little bit above the nose angle, bring it in as close as we possibly can, which is achieved by bringing it in until you see it in the camera and then backing it out. and that guarantees that the panel in relationship with the subject is as large as it possibly can be, creating the most soft wraparound light possible.
Our first image reveals the flat ambient light quality on Shirley and the loss of detail in the hair and background due to the overexposure of those areas. With the introduction of the white reflector panel, the level of illumination was raised in the subject area. After readjusting the exposure to produce a proper diffused value or true tone of the subject on film, detail is now visible in the background and in the highlighted area on the hair. The large size of the white reflector panel produces a soft, natural light quality on Shirley. Without the use of the panel, the light on the subject is flat, and relative to the hair light and background, the subject is underexposed. Also, to produce a variety of different moods on this shoot, Colins added a #1 soft-hard diffusion filter. And in addition to the diffusion, a warming filter was added to warm up the skin tones on the subject. Colins talks about the use of filters for outdoor portraits.
This particular photograph, this girl had perfect skin quality, so it didn't need to be diffused, but I felt that putting a #1 soft R, it's a Hasselblad soft R, over the front of the lens created really just a nice soft mood, especially with the expression, the whole feeling that she was creating. We also placed on it, just for skin tone quality, a 3-inch Ratten, an 81A or 81B would be the choices. In this case we used an 81B, which gives just the warm quality of the flesh tone, gives her a nice healthy look, and just creates an overall nice mood to it.
An understanding of how to use a flash outdoors can help you to create dramatic portraits against the late afternoon sky. To begin the final shoot, Colins places our model Shirley next to a fountain in the open shade of the park. With the late afternoon sun setting behind the model, Colins captures a few images of Shirley in the ambient light. In our first image, the light in the open shade illuminates the subject sufficiently, but the ambient light level in the shade is so low relative to the intensity of the background sky that the background is washed out and overexposed. A proper exposure of the background area leaves the subject so far underexposed that almost all detail on the subject is lost, and her hair and body nearly blend into the background.
This photograph really offered two problems. I liked the place where the pose could be. I liked the background, but first of all, there was no light at all coming in. All the light was way behind her. There was no directional quality to the subject. Plus, I was photographing a lot of the open sky, the bald sky. So by displacing the exposure of the subject, the results would be a very blown out sky and a very flat lit situation.
To provide separation between the subject and the background, a Metz strobe is mounted to a light stand and placed behind the model. In this position, the strobe provides a separation light on the hair and body of the model, but it does not affect the ambient light level on the front of the model. With the flash set at full power, Colins captures a few new images of Shirley. In the first image exposed for detail in the background, the ambient light level in the shade is not sufficient, and the subject is nearly silhouetted against the bright background. By introducing the strobe, detail at the edge of the model's hair and body is established, and the subject is now separated from the background. But the subject's diffused value, or the front of the subject, is still underexposed.
Now, a strobe can be brought in this situation, in this case as a backlight. A strobe coming from behind creating a nice separation on the hair, but still you have the same problem of placing the exposure to the diffused, because we haven't manipulated the diffused, so the background stays blown out and the subject still has no shape to the face. You have to realize that in all cases, especially with strobe, you basically are going to control your background brightness by the brightness on your subject.
To increase the level of illumination on the front of the subject, a Lightform P42 with white reflective fabric is attached to a stand and placed just outside of the left edge of the image frame. A new incident meter reading is taken with the dome of the meter facing the reflector panel, and the distance from the panel to the subject is then adjusted until the incident meter reading from the reflective panel matches the f-stop on the camera, which is set to record the background properly. With the setup complete, Colins works with Shirley to capture the final image. A look at the diagram reveals the placement of the strobe and the separation light that the strobe provided for the subject. Not only did the strobe provide detail for the edge of the model's hair and body, but but the light from the strobe also spilled past the subject, illuminating the entire white reflector panel. The soft light quality from the large panel increased the light level on the front of the subject, which allowed Colins to utilize an exposure that provided detail in the background. Our third image shows the effect of the strobe as an edge light on the model. By introducing the large reflector panel, the light from the strobe is bounced back into the subject area, raising the light level on our subject for the final exposure. Dean Colins talks about the use of the reflector panel.
To control the background brightness and to create some shape on the subject, we brought a P42 in as close as possible can. Now, P42 is a big panel. It's 6.5 feet by 6.5 feet. We brought in as close as we could to the subject, and this is done by just looking through the camera. When you see the panel, you just back it up. So that guarantees as close as it could possibly be, which makes it as big as it could possibly be to the subject. Strobe going past, hits the panel. It's a white one, so it's very evenly wraps around the subject to create that very late afternoon quality light. But it raised the subject's brightness with the strobe by 2.5 stops. And when we readjusted our exposure for the subject, it brought the sky down 2.5 stops.
Considered the leader in photographic education, Dean Colins has been teaching advanced lighting theories and techniques to photographers around the world for over a decade. This program is designed to provide some fundamental theories and techniques that can enhance your understanding of the science of photographic lighting.
This portfolio started by sitting down with my stylist and the model, identifying what looks she would look good in and what type of work she wanted to go after. Going through a whole series of magazines, letting her tear out the tear sheets, my stylist tear out the tear sheets that they liked, sitting down and figure out and breaking it down finally to the 9 shots we want to go after. This needs and requires a good understanding of light control, because we're not just going to go out and be a reactive photographer and shoot lots of pictures and then find 8 or 9 pictures we like. This is going after 9 or 10 definitive type of photographs where you have to have a full understanding of light control. So to understand light control in a proactive aspect, you have to understand that there's 3 elements to work with. There's the diffuse value, which is the true tonality of the subject. There is the specular highlight, which is the mirrored image of the light source, normally as shine or specularity or glisten in the skin. And then we have the shadow, which is the underexposed area of the subject, underexposed relative to the diffuse value. Then we have 5 elements of control with that. We have the diffuse to the shadow contrast control. We have the diffuse to the specular contrast control. We have the edge of the shadow between the diffused and the shadow. We have the edge of the specular between the diffused and the specular. And then we have, probably most important, is the diffuse consistency, keeping the diffused value, the proper exposure, the consistent exposure to identify the true tonality of the subject.
In this first of 7 photographs of model Karen Hallstrom, Colins uses a soft light quality and a seamless paper background to create a simple, contemporary fashion look. In this setup, the primary source of illumination is a Metz portable strobe with a simple hot light mounted on a special bracket from Bogen. The hot light, which acts as a modeling light, allows Colins to see the direction and relative light qualities that the strobe will produce without affecting the exposure. The strobe is directed through a Lightform P22 frame with translucent fabric. The 2 black P22 panels are added to control spill light from the strobe. The large diffusion panel dramatically alters the quality of light produced by the strobe, and a soft, natural-looking light quality is created. As Colins works with Karen, we can also see that the large source produces a less defined shadow of the subject on the background. A second P22 frame with white reflective fabric is set opposite the main light source to provide bounced fill light for the subject area. This soft, reflected fill light reduces contrast between the diffused value, or true skin tone, and the shadow area on the subject. As Colins records several different poses of Karen in the setting, we can look at a diagram of the lighting setup to better understand the methods of control that Colins used for the photograph. To increase the size of the main light source, a P22 frame with translucent fabric was set between the strobe and the subject. The large diffusion panel produced a soft wraparound light quality on Karen. To take advantage of the effects of the large source, Colins placed the panel as close as possible to the subject, leaving it just outside of the image frame. To reduce contrast between the diffused value and the shadow area on the subject, a second P22 with white reflective fabric was set on the shadow side of the subject. The light from the main diffusion source spilled past the model and bounced back off of the panel to provide detail in the shadow area. The result of this simple one-light setup is a contemporary fashion shot that shows the casual side of Karen in her portfolio. Dean Colins talks about the photograph.
This is a photograph that anyone that's looking for a model, looking at the portfolio, would look for. Is that, how does she look in Levi's? I want that very natural all-American girl look. They also look for how someone fits onto a neutral background, looking for a lot of copy traps, areas to where copy can put in. And this gray background works good in both reverse copy and black copy. So they do look for this in portfolios. But with that natural look, there's very little makeup worn, and models are very concerned about small blemishes or wrinkles, things of that nature. So that's why this particular lighting is done with one large panel, a 6.5 feet by 3.5 foot panel, and very, very close, with a small portable strobe backed up a little bit to illuminate the entire panel to create the largest source possible out of that panel. Low power, shooting this at about f5.6, so it doesn't take a lot of power to do it, and creates that effect that they're going to be looking for in portfolios.
In this image, the look of the 60s is revived in a high-key fashion shot of Karen. Throughout the day's shooting, makeup artist and stylist Carrie Patina worked with Dean Colins to create the different looks for our model Karen. The work of a professional stylist is a critical part of creating successful fashion imagery for a portfolio. To light the subject for this shot, Colins used a large umbrella with a white reflective interior surface. Suspended above the model to light the seamless background is a second MET strobe with a small piece of tough frost taped to the front of the strobe. The unit is attached to a Bogan adjustable boom stand. To establish a proper exposure for the subject area, Assistant Tim Mantuani takes an incident meter reading with the dome of the meter facing the umbrella. To ensure a pure white background, a second incident reading is taken for the overhead strobe. Colins makes sure that the background reads 1/2 stop brighter than the subject area. With the strobe bouncing into the umbrella, the size of the main light source is increased, and a soft light quality is produced for the subject area. The overhead strobe illuminates the entire background, and light bounces down off of the background to evenly illuminate the floor area under Karen. As Colins captures a variety of images, we can look at a diagram of the setup to see how Colins created the even, high-key look. To light the subject area with a soft light quality, the strobe was set to bounce light off of the interior of the large white umbrella. The light from the umbrella evenly illuminated the model from head to toe, but it did not illuminate the seamless paper background. To light the seamless background, a small piece of frost was taped to the front of the overhead strobe to diffuse and even out the beam spread of the light. The light from this strobe also bounced off of the background to illuminate the seamless paper under Karen's feet. A look at the photographs reveals the even illumination of the background from edge to edge, and the variety of fun poses that Colins captured for Karen and her portfolio.
When shooting a high-key full length with two lights, you have to be very efficient with your light. First of all, you want to contain your main source as much as possible and get as much power as you can out of those small portable strobes. Working with an umbrella does that. It creates that very large source because the actual source of light now becomes the size of the umbrella. Strobe fired back in evenly illuminates the entire umbrella. And the umbrellas are nice because they're very mobile. You can go butterfly patterns, pattern above the nose, side, very quick to move around. So it does create that soft wraparound quality like the panels do, but it's a lot more mobile. The efficiency of your secondary light for your background, though, is the real key to making this thing work. Taking that strobe up high, putting a piece of Roscoe tough frost around the front of the secondary strobe where you disperse the light in the background very evenly. It's not focused anymore, it's dispersed. Taking it up high above the model's head, put a small gobo so the model doesn't receive direct light from that secondary strobe, but you fire it down at the background. At that angle of incident, the angle of reflectance then is now to the floor of where the model's standing. So at that angle that it strikes, it bounces off just like a ball. If you threw a ball down at the background at that angle, it bounce and hit the floor and then bounce back up to the camera. That's what you want to do with your light to get the most out of it. To set the exposure for the background to make sure that it's pure white, is that you take an incident meter reading for your subject, and then you take a secondary incident meter reading for the background, and just set the background to be 1/2 stop brighter than what the subject's reading is. You shoot at the subject, and it guarantees the background is white, but this time it's a 1/2 stop brighter than white, so it's white without detail. That gives you your pure high-key feeling as you're looking for in this type of fashion work.
An outdoor photograph is an important part of a model's portfolio. For this photograph, Colins worked outside in front of his studio to create a simple, attractive headshot. With Karen positioned with her back to the sun, an incident meter reading is taken with the dome of the meter facing the white reflective panel. The Lightform P15 reflective panel is used to bounce soft, diffuse sunlight back toward Karen, thereby raising the subject's diffused value. Working at a low angle for this shot, Colins has his camera mounted to a small bogan ball head and a piece of plywood, which he calls a board pod. Because Colins is shooting with a telephoto lens, the narrow angle of view of the lens allows him to work with a very limited background of the business park. The reflector panel is held as close as possible to the model, just outside of the image frame, to take advantage of the effects of the large, diffused source. The soft light quality produced by the panel creates a very natural outdoor look for Karen. The final images show the raw sunlight illuminating Karen's hair and the soft, natural light quality produced by the large white reflector panel. Dean Colins talks about shooting outdoors.
In any portfolio, you're gonna want multiple looks to where the client is going to want to see how they're going to look in these different moods, because that's really what they're doing, is they're looking for someone to fit particular moods to sell product. Now, they always want to see how someone looks like outside, how they deal with sunlight, how they look in the natural surroundings. A lot of people confuse that they have to go to some big park and shoot. That's really not necessary. This particular series was shot right in our front lawn in a large business complex, and working with a 300mm 2.8 on my Nikon created that very shallow depth of field and a very narrow view. So with that particular lens, I could just go out in any lawn, pick up just where there is some foliage behind, compress it, work with a very shallow depth of field to create that effect, and then bring in one white panel in, bringing it in very, very close to bounce it in as my main light, setting an incident meter reading from that panel, and then setting a series of expressions and different clothings in that case to create that particular mood that fills out that look for the portfolio that they're going to be looking for.
Checking with a model's agency prior to shooting is an idea that is often overlooked. As agency director Tony Long tells us, knowing what to shoot can make a difference in a model's career.
If you're a photographer and you're interested in shooting images for models for their portfolios, the thing that I recommend highly is that you consult an agent or an agency to find out what particular style they're interested in. What is successful at getting jobs for models? What style of photography? Is it something that's very dark and moody? Is it something that's very light and candid, kind of slice of life thing? It's important for you to understand that, because that's what's going to make a model a lot more attractive to a particular agency or to a particular client.
The use of a small light source doesn't have to mean hard light quality on your subject. For this photograph, Colins manipulated the quality of light on Karen to create this light, airy photograph. For this setup, the Met's portable strobe is actually behind Karen's shoulder. To establish a proper exposure for the subject area, an incident meter reading is taken with the dome of the meter facing the white reflective panel in front of Karen. As Colins begins to work with Karen, we can see that the white panel serves as a reflector main for the subject area. The black flag above the camera protects the lens from lens flare. Light from the strobe also strikes a small mirror that Colins has positioned to bounce a pattern of light onto the background wall. With several small strips of light green gel taped to the mirror, the pattern breaks up the plain white wall and provides a sense of location. While raw light from the strobe does light the hair and shoulder of Karen, the light bouncing off of the white P22 panel provides the primary source of illumination for her face. As Colins records some different expressions and poses of Karen, we can look at a diagram to better understand the methods of control used for the photograph. Placing the main light source behind Karen allowed Colins to control the light from the strobe in several different ways. To begin, the raw light from the strobe illuminated Karen's hair and shoulder, giving the image the feeling that it was illuminated by raw sunlight. The majority of the light from the strobe spills past Karen and bounces off of the large white reflector panel in front of her. In this case, the panel serves as a reflector main for the subject. And finally, raw light from the strobe also strikes the small mirror to bounce a gel pattern onto the background wall.
A mirror is wonderful to work with on the background to create a background shape because it's like a directional spot or a focus spot that you would get on a very expensive strobe system because it is so directional. If you take a piece of tape and tape an X on the mirror, when you bounce it from the main light back on the background, it looks like a window shape. If you put colored gels draped across it, it starts to look like leaves of green trees. So it has a very controllable point to it, and it's very inexpensive to generate. But in this case, in this particular photograph, we had a fairly washed out background to begin with from the main light and from but the bounce filled back into the background. So by putting the color gels on, which in most cases the colors would be very strong because remember the light's going through the gel, hitting the mirror and bouncing back through the gel again, so it really doubles the effect of the gel. But this gel has still had a very pastel effect on this background because the background was already washed to begin with light. So when the color gels projected on, even though they were strong colors, they were washed out because the main light had already done their job.
A review of the final images shows the effects of the three ways that Colins used the light from the single strobe. By exposing for the light from the white reflective panel, the raw light on Karen's hair and shoulder is overexposed, which is a look that Colins wanted for this image. Dean Colins talks about the photograph.
This would be a photograph that you would often find on location. You're in an abandoned house shooting some portfolio work. You find this wonderful sunlight coming through, highlights off the hair and off the face, bouncing off the walls. I mean, it's a very natural looking photograph. But we have to take a proactive situation here. We just can't find it. We have to create it in our studio. So the most difficult thing is to identify exposure, especially using a strobe instead of using the direct sun. If it's a sunlight coming through, you just take a reflective meter through your camera, set the exposure and bracket and find the exposure that created the mood that you want. But you really don't have that luxury of dealing with a small portable strobe in this case as the sunlight. So setting up the METs, firing the strobe across the face a little bit to pick up that sunny effect as would be coming through a window, hitting a large panel, in this case a P22, which is 6.5 feet high by 3.5 feet wide. Bring the panel up high so you don't have a lot of bottom kick light. You want to bring it up high to direct it down. Bring the panel in as close as possible to where you create the largest effect possible. So bring it in real close, just inside of the camera view, and then back it up so that guarantees as close as possible. And take an incident meter reading with the dome aimed at the panel. Now that's your source of illumination to the subject. That's your main light, creating the diffused value. So you set your exposure for what the meter says, and set that exposure at that base, sets the proper exposure. The highlight does blow out, and sometimes it even loses detail, but that's okay. That creates that feeling, that mood that you would get from the direct sun. And be careful on white blouses in situations like that. You have a lot of bounce, a lot of strobe hitting that, bouncing back up. So if you have to, in this case we did, put a black drape across that just to stop that bottom bounce from kicking up. And put those combinations together and create that attitude, and you create that very soft late afternoon light.
Sometimes hard light can create the most striking images. In this segment, you'll see how Colins added only the color to create this glamour shot of Karen. To create the warm look that Colins wanted for this shot, a small piece of half-orange, half-yellow gel is taped to the front of the strobe. After taking an incident reading to establish a proper exposure for the subject area, Colins begins to work with Karen on some different poses. The small light source produces a well-defined, dense shadow of Karen on the background wall, which Colins is using as part of the composition of the image. The color created by the orange and yellow gel was checked with a Polaroid, and it was just what Colins was looking for to give the image a different feeling. The final images reveal the hard light quality and the dramatic, well-defined shadows produced by the small light source. Dean Colins explains.
This particular style of photograph is just very popular. It shows a lot of dimensions, a lot of shape, and the repetitious shadow on the background creates a lot of depth to it. Simply done, mimicking late afternoon sunlight, very directional light, putting a set of different colored gels too. It's not just a pure color, it's a mixture of two different gels, and we move them up and down on the strobe head until we come up with just the combination of warmth we're looking for. Incident meter reading, dome aimed at that directional strobe, creating that effect, very simple set of poses, but predominantly what we're doing is creating a lot of shape and form with a lot of repetitious shadow on the background.
Deciding which images a model should have on her Z card can be a difficult decision. Tony Long of Nouveau Agency in San Diego told us his ideas about creating a Z-card.
A Z-card is a model's condensed version of their portfolio. So it's important that you hit on 4 or 5 very specific but yet diverse areas, because this, in a lot of cases, clients will only get to see a model's Z-card. From that Z-card, they may make decisions or choices on who they want to use for a job. So it's important that it be diverse for one, and really straight to the point. You're going to need a really strong headshot for one. Going to need a great body shot, something that shows off that particular person's figure, and a really strong fashion shot. There are some cards that may have 5, 6, 7 photographs, but the 3 basic shots that you want to have are headshot, body shot, and good strong fashion shot.
To create this classic photograph of Karen, Colins used just 2 light sources and his understanding of light control. To light the subject for this photograph, a Metz strobe with a small modeling light is set behind a Lightform P22 frame with translucent fabric. The use of the panel increases the size of the main light source and evenly illuminates our model with a soft light quality. After taking an incident meter reading to establish a proper exposure for the subject area, Colins records an image of Karen illuminated by the main light only. A look at the photograph shows that by placing the large source to the side of Karen, only one side of her face and figure are illuminated, and the shadow form created by side lighting reveals the shape and form of her figure. Contrast is high between the diffused value, or true skin tone, and the shadow area. Also, Colins was careful to keep the amount of spill light on the background to a minimum, which ensured that the gray background paper would read as black in the photograph. To illuminate the background area, a second Metz strobe is set on a stand and placed between the main light source and the background, and a small piece of colored gel is taped over the front of the strobe. As Colins shoots, the background strobe illuminates only the gray seamless paper with saturated colored light. With the lighting complete, Colins records a variety of different poses, and by simply changing gels on the background strobe, he also creates several different background colors. A look at the diagram reveals that by placing a large translucent panel between the strobe and the subject, the size of the light source is increased. The soft side light reveals the shape and form of Karen's figure. To light the background, a second strobe was set between the main source and the background, and a series of colored gels were used to change the color of the neutral gray seamless paper. By looking again at our first image, we can see the effects of the background strobe adding white light only, and then adding the different colored gels that change the mood of each classic image of Karen. Dean Colins explains the lighting techniques.
On this particular body shot, we wanted to show the definition of her body and what good shape she's in. So working with a large source from one side, bring it across, all your shape and form and dimension is going to be created by the shadow, and this created a very strong shadow form. A lot of people would want to fill the shadow in because the ratio is too strong. If you did that, you would visually gain weight, plus you'd lose a lot of your dimension and roundness to the body. To create colors on the background, very striking colors, we started out with a dark gray background paper as our background. So when the main light hit it, even though it hit it with light, it did not contaminate it. So you can take a secondary strobe, put a color gel on, and aim it at that background, and with about minimum power, bring it up to a very strong color intensity. And if you wish to change your color backgrounds, you just essentially change your color gels on the strobe, and that's how you would create multiple color effects on the background.
In the final image of a full day of shooting, Colins created this swimsuit shot of Karen in his studio. To create the ocean background for this photograph, Colins sprays a piece of white seamless background paper with a can of blue spray paint. The technique looks simple, but there are a few things you should know about painting an ocean.
Doing a bathing suit shot for a portfolio often doesn't lend itself to a lot of ease of getting it done. It may be winter, there may be snow outside of your studio, you may not live near an ocean, or even if you do, the problem with crowd control and having to hire policemen to deal down there. When you start photographing people down on the beach in bathing suits, you attract crowds, so it can just be a real problem. So to simulate the quality or the look on the beach, really what you need is to generate the ocean. So this is done by taking a white seamless paper, taking blue spray paint, back up far enough to where when you spray the paint in a very straight line to create that horizon effect of the ocean, You want to spray to where there's still a lot of white showing through the paint. That creates that specular quality you would get off the ocean with the sun at a backlit angle.
To simulate the feeling of raw sunlight, Colins has positioned a strobe up high on a stand. A small piece of tough frost was taped to the front of the strobe to spread the beam of light to illuminate both the background and Karen. With the raw light striking the edge of Karen's face and body, light also passes by and bounces off of the Lightform P22 frame with white reflective fabric. As Colins continues to work with Karen, we can see the soft light quality of the bounced light from the large reflective panel. To take advantage of the large size of the panel, it was placed as close as possible to the subject to simulate the ambient light from the sand and sky at a beach. As the final images of the day are recorded on film, we can look at a diagram of the lighting setup. With the strobe set up high to simulate the position of the sun, we can see that the light from the strobe illuminates both the seamless background paper and Karen and the white reflective panel. A look at the final images reveals the sun-like quality of the light created by the raw strobe light and the soft ambient light quality produced by the large white reflective panel. With the painted background shot slightly out of focus, Colins has achieved the look of an afternoon at the beach in the studio. Dean Colins has some final comments on the photograph.
What you're doing here is you're trying to recreate what you'd normally find down the beach. You're trying to do it in your studio. So take a look at what that photograph would look like down the ocean. You have the sunlight from behind coming across, creating a hard rim light, hitting the white sand, bouncing back in, and you would normally expose for that light bouncing back in from the sand. So what you're going to do is take a small portable strobe, take a piece of Roscoe Frost, tough frost, put it over the front of your strobe, but bow it out like a small dome in front of your strobe. When the strobe fires into it, it spreads your light at 180 degree spread. Not only does it illuminate your subject, but also now spills light on your background and illuminates the blue paint you painted to create that ocean effect. Strobe fires on past, and you're going to put a white panel in as close as you possibly can, a Lightform P22, 6.5 feet by 3.5 feet. Bring the panel up high so you don't have a lot of down kick or light kicking up into the face. Bring the panel up high. Strobe fires on past, creating the rim light, hits the panel, bouncing back in, and that's your main light. You set your exposure by taking an incident meter reading of that panel and exposing for what the meter says. That sets the diffuse value dead on. Now you've created in your studio what normally you would find on the ocean.
Considered the leader in photographic education, Dean Colins has been teaching advanced lighting theories and techniques to photographers around the world for over a decade. This program is designed to provide some fundamental theories and techniques that can enhance your understanding of the science of photographic lighting.
Most people think about photographing beachwear down at the beach, and that's fine, but it's too difficult to shoot down there. It's a public place, so you have to have permits, you have crowd control problems. It's just a terrible place to work at. So we choose to use private pools. You can rent those, or maybe a friend of yours may have one. The only problem with working with pools is that people plant large trees for both privacy and windbreaks. So you have to become very proactive with your lighting. Usually you want to be reactive when you shoot this type, meaning that you just record what's there, the very natural look. But around a pool, the lighting is very bad because the only time you have direct sunlight is when it's directly above the trees. So proactive is the control of panels and mirrors to take any light situation and turn it into exactly what you want for that particular situation. Now, proactive control is the identification of three major categories of control. That is the diffused value, which is the true tonality of the object, keeping it consistent. The specular highlight, which is the shine or the moisture, which is the mirrored image, you might say, of the direct source, creating the diffused value, such as the sun or a strobe or even a panel. And then the control of the shadow, the area underexposed in the diffused, and creating most shape and form on lighter objects. The categories of control are basically five: keeping the diffuse consistent, keeping it in proper exposure placed, controlling the contrast of the diffuse to the shadow, controlling the contrast of the diffuse to the specular, and the edge transfer between the diffuse and the shadow, and then the edge transfer between the diffused and the specular.
Simple methods of outdoor light control were used to control the harsh sun of mid-afternoon for this poolside swimwear shot of Mariah. To begin the setup, a Bogan ball head is set in an upright position, and Colins' camera system is then attached to the tripod with the quick release system. The makeup on the model has already been completed, and the finishing touches are being added to her hair. With the elements in place, Dean Colins then begins working with Mariah for the first images of the day. For this photograph, Colins has the model positioned at the edge of the spa, and to increase the size of the light source and soften the light quality on the model, a Lightform P22 frame with translucent fabric is placed between the sun and the model. To provide separation for the model from the background, a large flexible plexiglass mirror is used to bounce raw sunlight back onto the model's hair and body. The large diffusion panel is placed as far in front of the model as possible to provide a natural wraparound light quality. As Colins captures his final images, we can look at a diagram of the setup to better analyze the light control methods that Colins used. To control the raw sunlight illuminating our model, a 6.5 foot by 3.5 foot diffusion panel was placed between the sun and the subject. The diffusion fabric is illuminated by the sun, and the panel then becomes the main light source for the subject area. Also, the panel was placed as close as possible to the model to maximize the effects of the large light source. To provide separation from the background and to reintroduce the feeling of raw sunlight, the plexiglass mirror was used to redirect the raw sunlight onto the shadow side of the model. Our first image reveals the effects of raw sunlight on our model Mariah. Contrast is relatively high between the diffused value, or true tone of the model's skin, and the shadow area. By introducing the diffusion panel, a softer, more natural light quality is created, and contrast between the diffused value and the shadow area is reduced. The use of the plexiglass mirror provides better separation between the model and the background, and also adds to the feeling of a sunny afternoon by the pool. Dean Colins talks about the light control used for the photograph.
When working with a panel in this situation, which is 3.5 feet wide by 6.5 feet tall, it covers the entire length of the subject, but when you work with the panel, you have to bring it forward as much as possible. And you do that by just keep an eye on the subject, keep the camera, bring the panel forward until the sunlight hits it, and then drop it back. That guarantees the panel is as far forward as possible, wrapping around the light around as much as possible to create that natural effect. Mirrors are important because it's a sunny day, and it's supposed to feel like a sunny situation. So somebody in a bathing suit without sun on them, it kind of has an odd feeling to it. So we always pump a mirror back in just to give a sunlight hitting them to create that sunny feeling. Working with 300 millimeter 2.8 on the Nikon gave me that very narrow view, so I could pick up many backgrounds in this pool. So by this pool side, I could have hundreds of different backgrounds because of that narrow view. When you do light the subject, though, you bring it as close as possible, but you still have to have the panel far enough away to create enough what we'll call light depth of field, areas where the subject can move, because the movement and the motion of the model in this, it really creates the mood, not just the lighting, but so much the attitude of the model.
An attractive figure is not the only factor that a talent agency looks for in a model. As agency director Tony Long tells us, it takes more than looks for a model to make it to the top.
Dean, what you find is one of the biggest misnomers in our industry for, specifically for swimwear models, is not that you just need a good body, a 34, 24, 34. That's not the only thing that you can have. In our industry, you have skills like any profession, and for models in our industry, what they really need is to have flexibility in front of the camera, the ability to bring life and spirit to a particular product. It could be a bathing suit, it could be a beer with a girl in a bathing suit. But it's important for the model to have the ability to give a particular client a number of different ways to look at the product, or actually the audience that they're gearing that particular product for. So some of the best models and the models that last the longest in the industry are the models that you'll find have the ability to move in front of the camera.
Light control is the key to producing stunning swimwear fashion shots, like this image of Susie. Before the shoot begins, Colins has our models sprayed down with water to increase shine on the chest and face. For this shoot, Colins mounted his camera system on a board pod. The small bogan ball head attached to a piece of plywood provides a stable platform for low-angle shooting. With the model positioned in the pool, a Lightform P15 diffusion panel is used to control the sunlight in the subject area. To provide separation for the model's hair, a small plexiglass mirror from Bogan is used to redirect the sunlight back onto the model. Because the model's body is in the water, the small mirror is sufficient to light her hair and shoulder. After establishing a proper exposure with an incident meter reading, Colins captures several images of Susie in the soft, diffused light of the panel. A look at the diagram of the setup reveals that the light quality in the subject area was controlled by using a 3.5 foot by 3.5 foot light-form frame with translucent fabric. The panel was mounted on a stand and held in position next to the model by an assistant. To create separation between the model's hair and the background, the small plexiglass mirror was used to bounce raw sunlight back onto the model's hair. By looking at the photographs, we can first see the effect of raw sunlight on our model Susie. Contrast is high between the diffused value of the subject and the shadow area. By placing the diffusion panel between the sun and the subject, the intensity of light was reduced, and the quality of light was changed to a soft wraparound light quality. Because the intensity of light on the model was reduced by using the diffusion panel, a new incident meter reading was taken in the subject area to re-establish a proper exposure for the subject's diffused value. When the camera is reset to properly expose for the lower light level, the key or overall brightness of the image is raised. Finally, the addition of the separation light from the mirror gives the image a feeling of a bright, sunny afternoon. Colins talks about the making of the photograph.
In this particular photograph, it had a unique quality to it because the lens was so close to the water. It was actually just touching the water almost, firing right across like the water was a big mirror surface in front of the subject. So when the panel was dropped between the sun and the subject, it lowered the subject's brightness. When we readjust the exposure for that loss in the subject, the background got brighter. Well, since the water in front of her was like a mirror of the background, the foreground then got brighter too. So it picked up this entire light key foreground and background. And when the background and foreground got brighter, it actually forced more attention to her because she was now the darkest portion, darkest part of the entire overall photograph. One thing that when you work with panels and you bring them in close and you work with panels on stands like this to where they're locked onto a stand, it'll cast a shadow from the stand onto the panel before it illuminates the subject. A lot of people are concerned that this is going to cast a shadow on the subject. It doesn't, because the light is actually a large soft wraparound bank and it doesn't affect the subject whatsoever. But if she had something shiny in her hand, or maybe a very shiny earring maybe, in the specular highlight of that panel, you would see a dark line running through it. But as for a lighting effect, that would be the maximum.
In another example of outdoor light control, Colins utilizes the technique of negative fill for this image of Mariah. With the model seated on a bench near the pool, Colins uses a large P22 diffusion panel to control the light quality in the subject area. To reintroduce raw sunlight into the photograph, a large flexible plexiglass mirror is used to bounce the sunlight onto the model's hair and shoulder. By using the large diffusion source as the model's main light, contrast on the model between the diffused value and shadow area is reduced. To allow Colins to control the density of the shadow area on the model, a light-form P15 frame with black fabric is held opposite from the main light source. The black fabric actually absorbs or subtracts light from the subject area. This negative fill increases the density of the shadow area on the side of Mariah's face. After establishing a proper exposure of the subject area with an incident meter reading, Colins captures a variety of images of our model. A look at the diagram of the setup shows us the different techniques of light control that Colins used for the photograph. To control the harsh sunlight, a P22 diffusion panel was placed between the sun and the subject. The use of the panel produced a much softer light quality on our model and reduced the contrast between the diffused value and the shadow area. To increase contrast again, a black negative fill panel was held on the shadow side of the subject. And to provide separation between the model's hair and the background, the large plexiglass mirror was used to bounce the raw sunlight back onto Mariah's hair. Our first photograph shows the effects of raw sunlight on our model. The hard shadow edge transfer produced by the sun is indicative of the effects of a small light source. Also, contrast is high between the subject's diffused value, or true skin tone, and the shadow area. By introducing the large diffusion panel, the shadow edge transfer dramatically increases in size, and contrast between the diffused value and the shadow area is greatly reduced. To reintroduce raw sunlight back into the photograph and to bring out the texture of the model's hair, The flexible mirror was used to bounce the sunlight back onto the model. And finally, to increase the contrast between the diffused and the shadow, the black negative fill panel was placed on the shadow side of the subject, just outside of the image frame. Dean Colins talks about the use of negative fill.
When working with the translucent panel outside, placing it between the sun and the subject, when you do lower the diffuse and create that very soft wraparound quality, it's gorgeous, but sometimes you raise the shadow too much in contrast, or in brightness, because when that diffuse lowers, the ambient light and the light bouncing off the walls, raising that shadow area, can flatten out the face. So by bringing a black panel, in this case a black light form P15, in very, very close, almost within the photograph but not quite, we've stopped that ambient from getting into the shadow and then created a nice shape to the face and actually narrowed the face down. In exposure, when exposing this film, even though I believe I can get my exposures dead on, sometimes I like to range the exposures very, very light to normal, because the mood actually changes. And so we don't really call this bracketing, we actually call it mood selection, to where you're really creating an exposure which might look better in this particular instance, so maybe it's a stop or a half stop hot. It's not overexposed. Technically it is, but actually it just creates a nicer mood.
The understanding of light control is not the only factor that is critical to the success of a fashion shoot. Proper makeup and styling is one of the keys to obtaining professional results.
Stylists are an integral part of a photo shoot involving a model. One of the most important things that you have to keep in mind is that you have a complete composition, and the stylists add to that. You have a clothing stylist, and then you have a hair and makeup artist. And these are two particular specific professions that will provide something, a mood or a feel that a particular photographer is trying to convey, be it in clothing or in hair and makeup. It's kind of a third eye when you have a hair and makeup artist there. Photographers focusing on the big picture. The clothing stylist and the hair and makeup artist are there to provide the fine detailing and to make sure that all things are correct. And always we find that when you have that on the set, the photographs are far better as the end result.
Sarah Leddick, a professional stylist with Nouveau Agency, had some valuable makeup and styling tips for shooting swimwear.
Well, first of all, when the model is booked for a job, you're hoping that the photographer, the client, will kind of screen out the models that are too pale or don't have the right figure, don't have the right cup size, or whatever problems that involves as far as filling the bathing suits. But you hope that they also book a model who's already tan. And if you have enough time ahead of time to be able to have the model go to one of the sun booths or tanning salons or whatever, that's really helpful, because the idea of having to do a body makeup, and if you're on a couple of day shoot, that really becomes quite time consuming. Full body makeup could take up to 45 minutes, and that's setting aside what it takes to do makeup on the face and also hair. So if the model could do her job and get tan ahead of time, that is quite helpful. There are little things that you have to deal with, which are strap marks and things like that, and that the makeup artist can handle quite well. As far as making up the face is concerned, you'd need a pan stick such as Max Factor or Shiseido. Any good quality product would do. The eyes, you'll need an eye pencil that you blend with a brush, as opposed to using a powder shadow, because obviously powder shadows will run in water. Lipsticks are always waterproof, so that's great, because you don't have to worry about that at all. And obviously waterproof mascara. As for hairdos are concerned, I would say that probably it's recommendable to keep the hair wet for the shots. It works well with the bathing suits, and also it's very manageable. You don't have to worry about the hair flying all over the place if the wind picks up. And there is a product called Phytoplage, or any kind of oil if you want to use on the hair, and it keeps the hair looking wet, but at the same time it stays looking that way. It doesn't dry out and you don't have to keep wetting it. I've always heard people talk about makeup being different for black and white than it is for color, and to tell you the truth, I've never done anything differently. I just do the most beautiful makeup that I can do, and it seems to work for both black and white and color. And one more tip, just remember to always make up the model in the shade. That way you can get her to keep her eyes open, so you can make up her face and not have tears all over the place.
Controlling the sunlight with two different types of reflectors, Colins created this late afternoon poolside shot of Mariah. To establish a proper exposure for the subject area for this photograph, Colins asks for an incident meter reading in the subject area. When using an incident light meter, always point the dome of the meter toward the main light source. In this instance, although the sun is behind the subject, the light bouncing off of the white reflector panel in front of the model is the primary source of illumination for the model. Therefore, Colins has the meter reading taken with the dome of the meter facing the white panel. The shutter speed and aperture reading that the meter provides tells us what to set the camera at for a proper exposure of the subject's skin tone or diffused value. Any professional incident meter, such as this Gaussian Lunistar F meter from Bogen, will provide accurate exposure readings in almost all circumstances. With the camera set, Colins begins working with the model's pose and with assistant Derek Bailey to angle a Lightform P15 with soft silver fabric to create a reflection of the sunlight on Mariah's stomach. The lighting is set and Colins begins capturing the images. In this setup, the model is backlit by the sun, and a P15 with white reflective fabric is used as a reflector main to provide a soft quality of light on our model. The soft silver reflector creates a highlight that adds definition to Mariah's stomach. As Colins continues to work, he records a variety of different poses and exposure settings. By looking at the diagram of the setup, we can see the way that Colins used two different reflective surfaces to illuminate our model. To create a soft frontal main light for the subject, a P15 white reflective panel was held close to the model to bounce diffused sunlight back into the subject area. To add separation and provide definition to the model's stomach, a second P15 with soft silver fabric was positioned to create a highlight on the wet skin. Our first photograph shows the initial effects of having the model backlit by the sun. The lack of any frontal light source leaves the model and her figure in a flat ambient light. The addition of the large white reflector panel raises the intensity of the diffused value of the subject with a soft directional light quality which helps to add shape and form to her face and figure. And the use of the soft silver reflector panel creates a highlight on the stomach that further reveals the model's figure. Dean Colins talks about the control of reflected light.
When you work with a reflective panel outside, you can work with it one of two ways, reflector main or reflector fill. Reflector fill is when you use a panel to bounce light back into the shadow area, controlling contrast to the diffused value. But reflector main essentially becomes the main light. You bounce the sunlight directly back into the face, it raises the subject's diffused value, you take an incident meter reading and expose for that. I use a white panel in this case because I want a very wrap-around, low specular quality of light. Some people will use a silver. I don't choose to do that because it creates a very specular quality, shiny quality in the skin, and it's very hard on the model's eyes, so I don't choose to use the silver at all. To create a separation quality showing the definition of the stomach and the tension of the skin, I will use a silver panel, but I do not use it as a fill. I actually bring it about 2 feet behind the subject and bring it in to where you can see off the stomach the highlighting, or you might say the reflection of the panel from there. But it is not a fill light, it is actually an edge lighting. But it's just like you're just picking up the highlight, the skimming highlight from the panel off the stomach and creating that actual definition to the tummy.
Working in the shade doesn't have to mean a lack of light control. In this segment, Colins redirects the late afternoon sun to produce the look of direct sunlight. With the model positioned in the shade, Dean Colins begins working with his crew to utilize the light of the late afternoon sun. By using a large plexiglass mirror to redirect the raw sunlight toward the model and a white reflective panel, Colins can recreate the feeling of direct or indirect sun in the shade. By adjusting the flexible mirror, the harsh light from the mirror can be directed to illuminate a large or small area on the white reflector, or the light can be spread to backlight the model's hair and illuminate the panel. As Colins shoots, the mirror is flexed to provide a variety of different looks and intensities on our model Susie. It is the flexibility of the 1/8-inch thick plexiglass mirror that allows Colins to achieve this level of control in the shade. A look at the diagram reveals that although the mirror was nearly 30 feet from the subject, the direct return of sunlight from the mirror provided Colins with a great deal of intensity and control in a shaded area. The large size of the mirror enabled Colins to create a very large or small pattern of light, which directly affects the quality of light returned to the subject area. Our first image of Susie shows the flat ambient light of the open shade. The swimwear appears drab, and the eyes of our model appear dark and without color. By bouncing the raw sunlight past the model to illuminate the large white reflector panel, the soft light from the panel brings the image to life. By changing the beam spread from the mirror, the model's hair and shoulder can be illuminated with the feeling of raw sunlight. Colins talks about the lighting technique.
This is the epitome of proactive control. I mean, the sun was almost gone. It was on the other side of the pool, but we still wanted to photograph that outfit on the shadow side of the pool. And we didn't want to have just a translucent quality. So what we did is fire the light on past the subject, hit a white reflector and bounce it back into the subject as a main light, and that actually became the main light. We could control the brightness of the separation because at the same time we were illuminating the panel, some of the light was hitting the subject, so we got both the separation and the main light in this one situation. But we controlled the brightness or the contrast between the separation light and the main light by how much light we would let strike the subject directly from the mirror or hit the panel. We could take it completely off the subject and only hit the panel, but we wanted both the quality of a sun hitting her plus the actual main light quality.
Swimwear fashion is often part of a model's portfolio, but checking with the model's agency prior to shooting is an idea that is often overlooked.
If you're a photographer and you're interested in shooting images for models for their portfolios, the thing that I recommend highly is that you consult an agent or an agency to find out what particular style they're interested in. What is successful at getting jobs for models? What style of photography? Is it something that's very dark and moody? Is it something that's very light and candid, kind of slice of life thing? It's important for you to understand that because that's what's going to make a model or make a model a lot more attractive to a particular agency or to a particular client.
In this final setup, Colins uses the flexible mirror to produce a wild hard light effect on our model Mariah. With the model positioned in the shade, Colins has the hard light from the plexiglass mirror redirected toward the model from across the pool. The large mirror is held high to avoid casting light from below the model's face. As Colins begins to shoot, the mirror is flexed and moved to produce a variety of different light patterns on the model. Colins works with Mariah to capture several different poses as the afternoon shoot comes to a close. The diagram of the setup reveals the large mirror held high to avoid an unnatural lower angle of light. And although the model is in the shade, the use of the mirror allows Colins to produce the feeling of a sunny summer afternoon. The final images show a variety of different poses and the different light patterns created by the mirror. To give the imagery a different look, Colins allowed those areas illuminated by the mirror to overexpose. Dean Colins has some final comments on the use of mirrors.
In this particular shoot series, we're not out doing portraits, so we're not really after just flattering light, making someone look beautiful. We're really actually selling clothes, fashion wear. So anything really goes if it looks right and if it sells the clothes. We wanted something of a very bright, very strong, kind of a wild feeling. So we went over with a mirror, plexiglass mirror, flexed the mirror back into where we got that maximum intensity on the subject, raised the subject in brightness, and when we exposed for this light, normally when we took an incident meter reading and exposed what the meter said, we actually would see a lot of texture in the skin, any minor blemishes or bumps or wrinkles, because when the light is that small, it produces a very hard shadow edge, and those imperfections pop out. It's like when you light somebody with a very small source, you're going to see wrinkles very easily. So we were working with a small source, and small blemishes were showing up. So by raising the exposure up to a very kind of a surreal look, about a stop and a half overexposed from what should be, it created that effect that had that nice pastel skin, but all the imperfections, the minor shadows suddenly disappeared and created a very, very nice skin quality.